Good evening, y'all, and welcome to this edition of History and Highballs, the Civil War and the Battle of Franklin at Carnton. My name is Stacy, and I handle adult education here at the museum. So whenever you join us for one of these History and Highballs programs, you and I get to virtually spend the evening together listening to some incredible stories about the places and people that make our state and beyond so special. If you enjoyed tonight's program, we invite you to head over to the museum's website at ncmuseumofhistory.org, where you can learn more about our upcoming programs, exhibits, and digital resources. This is also where you can find more information about joining our wonderful North Carolina Museum of History associates. Our associates and foundation provide crucial funding and support to the museum, which, in addition to many other things, helps make programming like this evening's event possible. We would like to thank those of you who donated funds towards this evening's program. We continue to do our best to keep our programs free to attend, but there are costs associated with keeping our series going, and we just continue to be so thankful of your generous support of the museum. A few quick housekeeping items for this evening. We ask that you please keep your mics muted throughout the entirety of the program, and that if you have any questions for our guest speaker, to please type them into the chat located at the bottom center of your screen. At the end of the program, I will ask our guest speaker as many of your questions as time allows. So it's my honor to introduce and welcome this evening's speaker, Bailey Lawrence. Bailey is the assistant curator at the Battle of Franklin Trust Incorporated, located in Franklin, Tennessee. BOFT manages 3 historic homes in Middle Tennessee that are connected to the 1964 Tennessee campaign, during which the battles of Spring Hill and Franklin took place just hours apart from one another. Prior to joining BOFT, Lawrence received her education from Western Carolina University, graduating in 2020 with a BS in anthropology and a BS in history. She continued her education at WCU and graduated in 2022 with a master's degree in American history with a focus in public history, as well as domestic and foreign war politics. During her time at WCU, Lawrence participated in many historic preservation and archaeological internships and projects. She also presented at the Southeastern Museum Conference in 2021 as one of their recipients for the Student Work in Museums Award. Bailey, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. All right. Let me see if I can share my screen and we don't waste any time getting started here. All right. So as Stacy, I am from the Battle of Franklin Trust, and today we're going to talk about the impact of the Civil War and the Battle of Franklin at Carnton, and then also beyond. If you guys have any questions at the end, I'd be more than happy to answer those. Let's see. So today I'm going to be covering the history of Carnton and the McGavock family, the Battle of Franklin and soldier experiences, life in Franklin, Tennessee post-war, and then also the legacy and memory for Civil War and the Battle of Franklin. These are key aspects that we talk about every single day at all 3 of our sites, not just Carnton, but also at Carter House and Rippa Villa. And this is Carnton right here, as you can see on this page, just to give you a nice visual. Now, let's actually start with the McGavock family. And it starts with a man named Randall McGavock. He moves out to Tennessee from Virginia in 1796. Whenever he moves out to Tennessee, it's because he had inherited about 300 acres of Carnton's original estate from his father. He moves out to eventually he hopefully wants to start, a farm, but he has to clear a lot of acreage first. So while he has some enslaved people that are working on the property to start clearing it, he is living and working in Nashville. He's working at the state Supreme Court. He works very closely with Andrew Jackson, and him and Jackson become very close work colleagues and friends. Now, if we fast forward just a little bit to 1826, that is actually when Randall moves his family out to Franklin for the first time. They had a summer house there that was built in 1815, but their main house was finished in 1826, which is the house that's standing today. So that becomes the McGavock family home, and Randall becomes a farmer full-time. He starts raising cattle, hogs, and sheep, and he's also growing corn, wheat, and oats. During this time, in between 1826 and 1843, Randall grows his farm to about 1,400 acres. And then by 1843, he actually passes away, leaving behind 1,400 acres and 22 enslaved people there on the property. Now, 1843 is where we start to enter what we call John's era, and that is actually when Randall's youngest son, John, takes over the estate. He inherits about 700 acres of the estate, and then also Carnton with it. Now, once we kind of enter John's era, I'll break it down here a little bit more in a second, but John's growing up in a world where it's vastly different from his father's. Randall was born before the American Revolutionary War, and then he's growing up in a time where he sees the 13 colonies expand pretty much all the way to the Pacific Ocean. John is born in 1815. He's experiencing a world that's just full of change and full of expansion, and we'll really see that come to a head in 1860. Now, by 1848, that's where we introduce Carrie Winder into the picture. John marries Carrie Winder in December of 1848, and we'll break down their family here in a second. But that's whenever she comes to Franklin, and she'll be a key figure in the Battle of Franklin for the Confederate hospital. Now, by 1860, you can already see that I've started to break down, what John is experiencing. By 1860, we see our country fracture, and then a war starts by 1861. And John plays a key role in some of the political elements that are happening during the 1860s. He's not immune to state and national politics. Just like his father was well connected, he is well connected too. Now, let's see. We have John McGavock and Carrie McGavock at the very top. Like I mentioned, they meet and get married in 1848, and they have 5 children over the course of 8 years. All 5 of the children are listed right here. Martha is born in 1849. Mary Elizabeth is born in 1851, and then John Randall, 1854. 1855 is when they welcome Hattie, and then 1857 is when Van Winder is born. Now, 3 of those children will not survive until adulthood. The 2 that will survive until adulthood are actually in the house the night of the Battle of Franklin in 1864. And those are the 2 children here at the bottom, Hattie and Winder. Now, Martha passes away around 1852, or 1862, excuse me. And then Mary Elizabeth passes away around 1858, and John Randall passes away just a few months after he's born. So John and Carrie, before they even reach the Battle of Franklin, they know what it is to experience loss. They lose 3 of their children, but they have no idea what the magnitude of loss is going to be whenever the Battle of Franklin literally comes right through their front door. So let's set the scene just a little bit more, because like I mentioned, John is growing up in a very changing time here in America. So we start right over here with the 13 colonies, as you can see. And this is a great map from the Library of Congress that shows the distribution of slave states and the population of slaves in each of those states in 1860. Now, by 1860, John and Carrie both own about 42 enslaved people at Carnton. And Williamson County, where Franklin is located, is the 3rd most populated slave county in Tennessee. Now, let's see, next slide. By the time 1860 does roll around, we have a lot of fracturing, we have a lot of splitting, and John has a front row seat to that. So as John is born in 1815, just 5 years later, the Missouri Compromise comes into effect, meaning that no slave state is going to exist above the Mason-Dixon line. This is part of the compromises that we kind of move forward with as our country is growing and changing. Now, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase has already happened, and then the domestic slave trade has actually already started before John's born, around 1809, 1811. Now, the domestic slave trade is going to continue to grow and flourish in America as we continue to grow as a country. Now, as you can see, the 3630 parallel, or the Missouri Compromise line, runs above Virginia, cuts into Missouri and over Kentucky, which is why Missouri is our compromise. And so moving forth, this is what we use for containment policies. And this is what we see and what John grows up with. So he only knows containment policies. By the time we hit Texas, Texas will be the last slave state to ever enter the Union before the war, and California will be the last free state to enter the Union before the war. Now, John has seen us just continue to jump back and forth across this imaginary line, creating a very real political divide and geographical one across our country. I think we all can agree that slavery is the driving force of the war. I mean, by this point, slavery has soaked in to our country, just like water soaking into carpet. It's soaked into every single fiber of the American way of life. It controls our foreign and domestic policies, our trade, our economics. It dictates how we bring states into the Union, and it dictates how we move forward as a nation. And so by the time 1860 rolls around, it's pretty much just a nail in the coffin, because 1860 rolls around and there are 4 candidates that run for president that year. Like I mentioned, John is kind of wrapped up into this as well. John in 1860 serves as a Tennessee delegate for the Democratic National Convention held down in Charleston, South Carolina that year. He goes down to see that not only his country is being torn apart over the issue of slavery and secession, but his own political party is. They can't decide on a candidate to run, so they run 2. And John can do nothing to stop this. And so ultimately, there is a third party that runs, 2 Democrats and then 1 Republican. And that Republican is voted into office. He's the first Republican ever voted into presidential office. And his name is Abraham Lincoln. He's voted in as the 16th president as the United States. And even before he takes his inauguration, South Carolina secedes in December of 1860. Now, after South Carolina secedes, more states are going to follow after that, as we know, but Tennessee will be the last and 11th state to leave the Union. They leave in June of 1861, and it actually takes about 2 votes for Tennessee to leave. The first time that Tennessee goes to vote to secede, it doesn't really even come to a vote. Second time that Tennessee votes as a state, they ultimately vote to secede. Both of these times, John is writing down saying, he doesn't believe in secession. He owns 42 people on his property. He's a part of the domestic slave trade. That's how he's been brought up. But both times he votes not to secede. There are complexities upon complexities within Civil War history, within American history. John is one of those complexities for me whenever I look at this, because, it's not just black and white whenever we look at American history. It's not just, secession or preserving the Union. It's all kind of mixed in together. And Tennessee is one of those states, because we are divided in 3 regions. We have East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, West Tennessee. Each one are vastly different. And you see that from John's perspective right here. Good Lord, he's worth about 10 to 11 million in today's money in 1860. And so whenever he votes to preserve the Union, he doesn't think that slavery is probably going to end within his lifetime. But he's thrust right into the middle of a civil war, not really knowing what's coming next. By 1862, they know what's going to come up. By 1862, in February that year, Fort Donelson falls. It's a major fort that's here in Middle Tennessee. And just a week or so later, the city of Nashville is the first Confederate capital to fall to U.S. control. So now John and Carrie, and at this point, their 2 children that are left, are living in Nashville, in the Nashville area and in Middle Tennessee, as Tennessee comes under U.S. occupation. And it'll remain under U.S. occupation until the end of the war. So as John and Carrie kind of set forth in this new unknown, John sends all of his enslaved further south down to Alabama at this point. This is essentially his insurance policy that they will not run away to Nashville, because they don't really have to get that far into Nashville, because there's U.S. troops just spread all around us here in Franklin. And so that's just his insurance policy. Once he does that, he's still renting and hiring out other enslaved from other farms and plantations in the area, but it is a skeleton crew essentially. Now let's jump forward just a little bit. Now by 1863, the war has changed drastically. We see that by January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation is declared. Now that is essentially designating that this war is going to be about slavery, and it is about the ending of slavery. So Lincoln has said, this is about not only bringing the U.S. back together, bringing all our states back into the Union safely and soundly, but at the end of this, slavery is not going to exist. Now, I have kind of breezed over the Civil War, so you have to bear with me here, because they don't really see a lot of action here in Franklin until the fall of 1864. And it's after September 1864 when the city of Atlanta falls to U.S. control. It falls to William Tecumseh Sherman, and John Bell Hood and the Confederate Army have to evacuate out of Georgia and into Alabama. Once they evacuate into Alabama, John Bell Hood kind of has a recoup, little bit of time. He has roughly 30,000 troops under his command at this point. And by November of 1864, he decides, I'm going to invade Tennessee. I'm going to try and take back Nashville because it was the first Confederate capital to fall to U.S. control, and Tennessee's been under federal occupation since 1862. It's a big boost to the Confederacy at this point, who was on its last legs, and little did he know this is going to be the beginning of the end for the Confederacy and this fight for their secession. But in November of 1864, as John Bow Hood looks north to Nashville, he has a pretty good chance of actually getting it back if nobody stands in his way. Like I mentioned, he has 30,000 troops under his command. Nashville at that time is only protected by about 8,000 United States troops. It's kind of a no-brainer. Do quick math. You know that if you get there first, you can actually take back the city. Nashville holds a big river and also a bunch of railroad depots. And so it's a major supply hub for the Confederates if they can get it back, because at this point, you know, the Anaconda Plan is really working for the U.S. Army to cut off trade and to cut off supplies for the Confederate Army. So slowly just draining them down. Now, for the Tennessee campaign, there are two men that are involved in this. Like I just mentioned, John Bell Hood, but then also another man, General John M. Schofield for the U.S. Army. Let me mention, these two men know each other. They went to West Point together before the war. They were classmates and roommates there, and they graduated together there. They are opposite personalities. John Bell Hood for the Confederate Army, he's bold, he's aggressive, he's very strategic. And John Schofield, he's kind of your safety. He's going to play it safe. He's a people watcher through and through. He's meticulous and calculated. He likes to see people play their hands before he plays his. And that's exactly what he does for this Tennessee campaign. He plays it smart. He plays it safe. Now, during this time, Hood is going to invade Nashville, and the main road that he's trying to get on is the Columbia Turnpike. The Columbia Turnpike has been splitting Middle Tennessee in two since 1840. Now, it runs from Alabama to Kentucky right through Nashville. It's the quickest and easiest way to get to Nashville at that point. He's got 30,000 troops to move. That's the road that he's going to use. Now, John Schofield is dispatched by Sherman to try and cut Hood off at the source. So by the time these two armies meet, they are in Columbia, Tennessee, which is roughly 20 miles south of Franklin, Tennessee. What stands in their way for the Confederate Army is the U.S. Army, essentially blocking the road because they have control of it. Now, for Hood to get out and around the U.S. Army at this point, he's going to have to go on a major outflanking maneuver, because the way that Columbia is set up, he has to cross a river and then he's got to go across farmland. There's no way to essentially get right through to the road. So on November 29th, 1864, Hood sets out with about 20,000 Confederate troops in a major outflanking maneuver. And at this point, this is what we know of as the Battle of Spring Hill today. Throughout the course of the day, the objective for the Confederate Army is to take back the Columbia Turnpike as they swing out and around all the way up to Spring Hill, Tennessee, just 12 miles north of where they were. They hope to reclaim the road. Now, throughout the course of the day, there's some major miscommunications that happen. First things first, Schofield sees that Hood's moving his army. Since Schofield has the most direct route to get to Nashville, which means he also has the most direct route to get to Spring Hill, he sends a couple of units on up with artillery and infantry. And so by the time the Confederate cavalry even arrive, Spring Hill is locked down, and Confederate cavalry start getting hit with artillery. They pull back and they set up camp. There's no message or relay of information for the rest of the guys who are moving on foot that day. There's roughly about an hour of combat hand to hand, but essentially the Confederates move up to the road. They get about 100 yards from the road. They get orders to pull back from the road, and eventually it's too dark for them to do anything else. They have no idea what's around them. They know that they've been hit with artillery fire. They have no idea where the road is at this point, but they get orders to camp out and go to sleep. At this point, it's cold, it's wet. You know, they've been trudging through the mud all day. They've been in an absolute sprint to get to Spring Hill since early that morning, and they go to sleep hard. Schofield's still watching the road. Like I mentioned, he's meticulous and he's calculated, but he's meek, he's mild, he's your safety player. He's not the one to make bold moves. And that night on November 29th, Schofield moves the rest of his 17,000 troops, 6,000 horses and mules, 800 wagons, and 60 pieces of artillery right past Hood and the Confederate Army. The only thing separating these two armies are 200 yards of open rolling farmland. Once they hit the checkpoint in Spring Hill, they are sent right on up to Franklin. By the time they reach Franklin, Tennessee, which is just roughly 12 miles north of Spring Hill, they start fortifying the city. Now, you can't go out and around Franklin. You have to go straight through it. And unfortunately, there are a couple of bridges that are out. And unfortunately, you're going to have to rebuild those bridges to get across one key geographical figure in Franklin, which is the Harpeth River. So Schofield gets his guys onto work. They start rebuilding those bridges. He also sends a couple of guys to the edge of the city, which is essentially where Carter House is, which is what we manage today. And they take over Carter Hill and they fortify Carter Hill as the front line that day for the Battle of Franklin. Now, they don't expect a fight whenever they start to throw up some earthworks and whenever they take over the Carter House's headquarters, but you never know. Hood wakes up that next morning on November 30th, realizing that the U.S. Army has moved past him in the middle of the night. He starts moving his army up as quickly as possible. So again, it is an all-out foot race to get to Franklin. He's trying to catch up with them because the objective is to get to Nashville first. Once you get to Nashville first, you've got the city. On November 29th, or on November 30th, apologies, on November 30th, 1864, this essentially is what's going to lay the groundwork for the Battle of Franklin. Now, Hood, as you can see, if you can follow my cursor right here, Hood is right back here. He's on a place called Winstead Hill. This is where he starts to make his plan and devise what he's going to do that day. Now, Hood has roughly 20,000 troops. The thing to remember is Hood moves with all of his troops on November 29th that can move very quickly. So he moves cavalry, he moves infantry, guys on foot and on horseback. He doesn't hardly move any of his artillery. He leaves that south in Columbia because it's too slow and he needed to be fast on November 29th. So whenever he shows up on November 30th, he has hardly any artillery with him. And whenever he decides to start advancing, and this is, essentially going to be a full frontal assault onto the town of Franklin, and it just kind of convalesces right there at Carter Hill. He's coming from almost a 2-3 mile stretch down to a very, very narrow, tiny little spot. And essentially, they're just getting mowed down by the end of the day. This will become a decisively defensive battle for the U.S. Army at the day of the Battle of Franklin. But let's get back to the McGavocks, because I've talked about, the armies moving right through Middle Tennessee. These two armies are just going to collide here in a few minutes. But who's actually at the house? That day at the house, there's only Hattie, Winder, John, Carrie, a couple of enslaved, and a governess named Elizabeth Costin. Now, as you can see from this map right here, Carnton is this little black dot. Confederate Army is formed up right here, and the U.S. Army is this blue line right here. This is the front line. Everybody at Carnton, the days leading up to this, can hear all the artillery fire that's happening down in Columbia. They can hear all the artillery fire and the clash that's happening down in Spring Hill. They can hear the storm growing towards them. They have no idea how it's going to impact them. But at 4 o'clock on November 30th, 1864, they hear what sounds like thunder. What it's going to be is the entire Confederate Army advancing across their fields northwest towards Carter House. As this is happening, William Loring's division, with roughly 3,500 men, will be crossing right over their yard, essentially splitting their house in two. And at the same time, you also have General Walthall's division, who are right over here. That's 2,300 men that are coming right across their northwestern fields. That's just two divisions. That's over 5,000 men just swarming across your fields. Now, that all starts at 4 o'clock, and those men are being met alone. Loring and Walthall's division are being met with about 10 pieces of artillery. Firing back down towards them are big cannonballs, big canisters filled with shrapnel and incendiary, bursting before impact, taking out dozens of men at a time. All starting at 4 o'clock. By 4:10, the McGavocks get a knock on their front door. It's going to be a chaplain from Loring's division, and he says, "Make room, your house is becoming a hospital." So John and Carrie probably shuffle their two children out of the way. They start moving every piece of furniture up to the sides of the walls, taking anything valuable upstairs that they can before the first men start arriving. Let me tell you what, it's going to be a lot. As this is all happening, John and Carrie are preparing. Surgeons are setting up in their house. The fight's still going on. I'd like to also mention that when this battle starts, it's 4 o'clock. And here, because we're on Central Time and we're really close to that line, it gets dark here in the fall around 4:30. It's not a very common thing for people to fight in the Civil War at night. So for about 4.5 hours, the battle is raging in the dark. There's no wind that day. It's unseasonably warm. So anything that's being fired across the fields is just settling in the air. Now, by about 4:25, the Confederates have moved past Carnton. They're advancing again, continuing towards Carter Hill. You can actually see where this first line of defense is right here with George Wagner's division. Eventually, Hood's army will hit that line. Wagner's men will push back to the main line right here at Carter House. You can see my pointer right here. Carter House is this little black dot, and this is the US line. It runs roughly for about 2 miles in a stretch. Carnton again is right back here. Now, Wagner's men, as they push back towards that main line, they're essentially used as a human shield for the Confederates to continue to advance towards the main line right here. Now, that's at about 4:30. They hit that first line at 4:30, and from about 4:35 until 9 o'clock that night is when all of the heavy hand-to-hand combat fighting is happening. Now we're going to fast forward to about 7:30 at this point, 7:45. This is what's happening all throughout that time. Now, from 4:30 to 9:30, like I mentioned, that's all the heavy hand-to-hand combat fighting that's happening. I am not one of our battle specialists. I will recommend you to go, talk to some of my other colleagues who can give you great battlefield tours. But I'm not the one to talk about, what's happening of very specific parts. I can give you a very general overview. But if you have any questions, please let me know at the very end. All these stars that you see that are on the map right here in front of you, the yellow stars, these are where all of the Confederate generals get hit and they actually die. One's actually only mortally wounded, but there are 5 that are killed basically right on site. And those out of, about 10 brigadier generals, Hood loses 6. And so he loses John Adam, Patrick Claiborne, Hiram Granberry, Otho Straw, States Rights Gist, and John Carter. Now, 4 of those men are actually laid out on the back porch of Carnton that next day, and it's going to be Claiborne, Granberry, Adams, and Straw. They're laid out on the back porch of Carnton for men to come by and pay their respects for those brigadier generals. Let me just mention before I move on, within 5 hours of fighting, there are 10,000 casualties. If anybody's familiar with Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, this is twice as big. 5 hours, 10,000 casualties in total, 2,500 dead, 7,500 wounded, and about 1,000 missing or captured. 2/3 of that number, which is roughly 7,000 casualties, are Confederate. Like I mentioned, this is a truly decisively defensive battle for the US Army. All they have to do is sit back and make sure that they can start mowing people down almost immediately. Now, what's happening at Carnton during this time? Because they're not immune to what's happening. Their fields are getting hit, their livestock's getting hit with all that artillery fire as those men move across, but they're also trying to organize chaos at this point inside of their house because men are just being brought back by the droves from the front line. Now at Carnton, each one of those rooms, there's about 8 or so rooms that are used for the Battle of Franklin, as well as the hallways and then the stairs. Each one of our rooms are about 20 by 20, so fairly massive rooms if you can imagine it. There are roughly 30 to 40 men in every single room of the house, 2 surgeons, 1 at each window. Hallways, staircases are just filled. If you can't get inside the house, they're putting them in and around the house. They're using every single outbuilding that's there on the property as well. By the end of the night, there are roughly 600 dead and dying men in and around their house waiting to be treated and cared for. But I don't have to just tell you that. There are soldiers' accounts that will tell you that too. There's a man named William Gale. He is with AP Stewart's Corps that are also moving across the fields that day. He's a staff officer for him, so he's not going to be in the direct hand-to-hand combat. He's working more in his office for him. In the letter back to his wife, he details the experience that he has during the Tennessee campaign and also the Battle of Franklin. I'm just going to read this for you because it's much easier than me trying to memorize it. When day dawned, we found ourselves near her house, meaning Carrie's house, in her lawn, which was at the rear of our line. The house was one of the large old-fashioned country houses, 2 stories high with many rooms and every arrangement for comfort. This was taken as a hospital, and the wounded and hundreds were brought to it during the battle and all the night after. Every room was filled. Every bed had 2 poor bleeding fellows. Every spare space, nick and corner, under the stairs, in the hall, everywhere, but one room for her family. And when the noble old house could hold no more, the yard was appropriated until the wounded and dead filled that, and all were not yet provided for. Our doctors were deficient in bandages. She began giving her old linen, then her towels and napkins, then shirts and tablecloths, and then her husband's shirts, and then her own undergarments. During this time, the surgeons piled their dreadful work amid the sighs and moans and the death rattle of the stricken. During all the night, neither she nor anyone in her house slept, but dispersed tea and coffee and such stimulants that she had, and that too with her own hand. Unaffrighted by the sight of blood, unawed by the horrid wounds, unblanched by the ghastly death, she walked from room to room, from man to man, her skirts stained with blood, the incarnation of pity and mercy. Is it strange that all who were there praise her and call her blessed? I love how he ends that with a question. Because if you look at the McGavock family that are there that night, Carrie's the one who is, helping all of these soldiers. We think that the children were shuffled away to a room in the house, but by the end of the night, we know from soldiers just like William Gale and other ones in the house that the kids are down there with their mom serving tea, water, and coffee to any of these guys if they need it. Now, I also need to mention their little girl Hattie is 9 years old that night. Their little boy Winder is 7. So Winder's not really going to know what's going on in his life. He's not going to be very scarred from it. He never talks about it later on, but Hattie remembers it. She's 9 years old. When you're 9 years old, you have the time to make those memories. This is a scarring event for her. Now, John is not only helping his wife inside the house, trying to organize that chaos, but he becomes, a part of the triage units. He's carrying men from his own yard and into the house because this man was saying, as one man would die, another one would take his place. They're just rotating people in. It's like clockwork. As one man is treated, that surgeon's turning around and moving that other wounded guy off his table that's been treated and bringing back on a new one. Now, there's another man who also gives us a great description of what's happening in the house. His name is George Estes. He's a part of the Mississippi Infantry moving across the fields that day. He is with Loring and Walthall's division. It's Mississippi men who are coming right over the grounds of Carnton, and he is hit as he's coming across the fields. And in his statement, he says, "The Yankee cannons and muskets mowing us down like grass before scythe. They carried me back to the palatial home of Colonel John McGavock. They laid me off the litter in the front yard, where were hundreds of dead and dying men. The residence was literally full to overflowing with the dead and wounded men. As soon as one would die, another one was ready to take his place on the floor or anywhere that there could be room for him. Such groans, cries, and curses I heard that night, I hope I will never hear again." So what Gale is saying, what Estes is saying, it shows us this dichotomy of 2 different worlds that are colliding all at once. It's this one event that's connecting these 2 worlds. You've got the McGavock family that's been hardly touched by the Civil War at this point, and it literally is coming right through their front door into their house, spilling out onto all of their floors. And you also have soldiers who have, been away from home since 1861. The 20th Tennessee is moving right through here with Hood at this point. They haven't been home since 1861. A lot of these guys enlisted in 1861. Now, Estes, by the time somebody finds him a place in the house, he actually makes it to the front porch. And also in his account, he says that the McGavock's front porch is the first wooden structure he had been under in a year. That again shows you not only what the McGavock's view is of just absolute chaos and carnage, but Carnton now becomes this comforting place for the soldiers that are coming into the house and being treated. Now, it's not all comforting for those who are coming in the house. It can be very unnerving, but it's a safer space than what it's being like out there on the battlefield, just dying alone. Now, another man I do want to talk about, his name is John T. Lowe. He is a surgeon with the 43rd Mississippi Infantry. He is one of the surgeons we believe that's in there in the house that night. And if he's not in the house, he's on the grounds treating men as well. Now, Lowe graduated from the University of Alabama in 1842 with a medical degree, and by 1862, he was commissioned into the Confederate Army as a surgeon. Lowe was most likely one of those surgeons that's treating men inside the house because he is moving with Loring's division, and they are the ones who take over Carnton. Now, Lowe, like many others, other surgeons that are operating there that night, they operate for about 36 hours straight. Straight through the night into the next day and into the next evening as well. These surgeons, like I just mentioned, they're highly trained. They know what they're doing. Now, if you're hit in the head, the chest, the stomach, there's little to nothing that these surgeons can do for you. If they bring you into the house, it's just a mercy so that you can die in somewhat of peace, or you can be around something comforting. Now, if you're hit in an extremity like a leg or an arm with a lead bullet or any kind of grape shot, canister shot, they're going to have to remove that as soon as possible. A very common method for saving men's lives at this time is actually going to be amputation. So surgeons, just like Lowe, are tying off your arteries like we do today. That becomes a very common practice during the Civil War, is tying off arteries, but they're also using anesthesia. Chloroform and ether both are used at Carnton. Chloroform's very strong though, ether's very flammable, which is why these surgeons are set up by the windows at Carnton. They need good light and good ventilation. Lowe goes on after the war. He survives the Battle of Franklin. He gets out of the Confederate Army. He gives his oath of allegiance. And he goes back to Mississippi. He never gets married. He lives and works in Mississippi as a doctor. And he ends up dying in 1880 at only the age of 55 years old. Now, on the cause of death listed on the U.S. mortality schedule, it says he dies from soft brain, which I had to look up, but it's essentially a cerebral hemorrhage. And so he survives all of this just to die at 55 years old from a cerebral hemorrhage. John A. Moore, right here in the middle. He's another one who actually survives the Battle of Franklin. John A. Moore is with the 14th Mississippi Infantry. He's with Loring and Walthall's divisions. He actually enlists in 1861 in Corinth, Mississippi. He's wounded at Franklin. He takes a gunshot wound to the chest. And from what we know, he's treated at Carnton or in town that next day. And he is actually taken as a prisoner of war after the U.S. Army comes back through. Because he's wounded, he's sent to Nashville, and he recoups there in a hospital in Nashville. And then essentially after he has gotten better, he spends the remainder of the war in Rock Island, Illinois, at a Confederate prisoner of war camp. After the war, Moore's released. He gives his oath of allegiance at Rock Island in Illinois. And then he gets married, has about 6 kids, and all of his descendants just continued to say, he grew a long beard so that he could cover up that gunshot wound, but it was still visible. They knew that it was there. It never covered up all of it. Moore, just like many other men, not only suffered from both physical scars, but also mental and emotional ones from this battle that stays with them until the day that they die. Noel Nelson, one of the last Confederate guys I'm going to talk about with you right now. Noel Nelson is a lieutenant colonel for the 12th Louisiana Infantry. He is wounded. He gets hit in the gut and in the leg by some grape shot and some canister shot at very close range. He would have been more towards, the opposite side of Carter House on that farther left flank of the battlefield. He's brought back to Carnton, treated there. Now, many of his men, especially one of his, aide-de-camps, is just right there by his side all throughout the night. Noel Nelson's experience is unsettling for many men that are in and around the house at that time, but he's not the only man that's crying out in pain, crying for the sweet release of death. Now, Merrill, who is his aide-de-camp, he is in a letter talking about how he's with him during the last agonizing hours before he dies. And in his account, he says, Nelson lay dying, torn to pieces by a discharged grape and canister at close range. Both legs were crushed by a cannonball, and his bowels torn by iron grape. His eyes, through exhaustion caused by pain, sank back into his head. He screamed, "Give me 40 grains of morphine." He called out through the night, "Give me 40 grains of morphine and let me die. Oh, can't I die? My poor wife and my child, my poor wife and my child. Oh, Merrill, can you not get the surgeons to administer some drug that will relieve me of this torture?" Merrill says that he did try, although his appeals were in vain. He says that cold perspiration gathered in knots on his brow, and of course he knew that death was inevitable for Nelson. He said that he went down the steps and far out beneath the silence of the stars to escape his piteous prayers. Nelson is actually buried in Section 1 of the Louisiana section at Carnton in the Confederate Cemetery. That letter is Merrill's memory. What he then writes to Nelson's wife is a completely different memory in itself. Merrill gives Nelson's wife a more serene picture of how her husband passed away. He shields her from the actual agonizing death that Nelson did experience. And in his letter that he sent to Nelson's wife conveying that he had passed, he never conveys at all that he was in pain or in agony. He describes Nelson as he passed as one of the most peaceful corpses that you had ever seen. It was like he had merely fallen asleep. That is the one thing that they just continue to try and shield others from during this time. Now, while all of this is happening over at Carnton throughout the night, by midnight on December, Lord have mercy, can I get this right? November 30th, 1864, by midnight, Schofield and the Army have escaped across the bridges at Franklin, and they are in Nashville by December 1st that next morning. And so essentially the Confederates are just left behind. The U.S. Army moves out as quickly as possible, but there are still some U.S. dead that are left unburied. Some of the men that are here for the U.S. Army, we're going to start right over here with a man named Henry Ackerman. He is a private in the 64th Ohio Infantry. Now, Henry's one of my favorite for the U.S. Army. Henry Ackerman actually immigrated from Germany in 1863, and just a couple of months after he had moved here, he enlists in the 64th Ohio Infantry. Now, he's at the Battle of Franklin. He survives, but he's wounded. He's treated in Nashville, and then after the war, he actually gets married, has a wonderful family, and then he eventually passes away at 95 years old in 1841. Just like Henry Ackerman, who's here at Franklin, he's in the heat of the fighting. He joins the Civil War, which he didn't have a dog in the race whenever he, was born. He was born in Germany. But Ackerman, just like many other immigrants who immigrate during this time in America's history, they pick up arms and they fight for whatever side that they want to. Patrick Cleburne is an Irish immigrant. He fights for the Confederates. He is actually killed at the Battle of Franklin. He's one of those generals laid at the back porch of Franklin. There's so many immigrants for the U.S. Army at this point that are actually at Franklin. Another great guy is actually Almon B. Daniels. He is a private for the 111th Ohio Infantry. Almon Daniels actually enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1862 with his brother, Oscar. Oscar, his younger brother, enlists just 3 days after him. Both actually fight at the Battle of Franklin. They had served together, fought many different battles. But at Franklin, Oscar passes away. Almon is captured. Almon, that next day, is most likely one of the prisoners for the Confederate Army that are burying all of the U.S. dead. Now, because Almon fights right next to his brother and he knows that Oscar passes away, it's most likely that the reason that Oscar is identified is because Almon was able to identify him and bury him that next day after the battle. So during this time, he's actually sent down further south to a Confederate prisoner of war camp before the war ends. And his wife at the time gets no information back from him after the Battle of Franklin. So she presumes that he's dead, and she files for a widow's pension with the U.S. Army, and she's denied that pension, and that's right before the Civil War comes to a close. And then after the Civil War comes to a close, just a couple of months later, Allman shows back up. She had no idea that he was still alive. She's denied that pension, so that's kind of a double whammy right there, thinking, your husband's not coming back, and then you're not also going to get a widow's pension, and then Allman shows back up. We don't have phones at that time, so it makes it a little bit difficult to just say, hey, I'm okay. And so letters get lost a lot of the times, and sometimes, recording is not that great, especially when you have prisoner of war experiences. And so he was captured. And luckily, Allman lives until 1922, and he passes away at 83 years old. Now, other two guys I do want to talk about before our time does kind of end is actually Ezra and Mulholland Bond. Their father and son, they fight at Franklin. Both of them survive. But just like the Bonds right here, there are many other guys for the U.S. Army and the Confederate Army that know each other, that are related to each other, that fight side by side that day. And a big reason that a lot of the Confederate soldiers that are buried at Carnton is by somebody who knows you and somebody who can recognize you. Now, Civil War's come to a close. It ends in 1865, but by 1866, they need to do something about all the bodies, because in 1866, those bodies have frozen, thawed, decomposed to basically bone. And the McGavocks decide, we're going to donate 2 acres as an extension of our own family cemetery for this project of creating a Confederate cemetery. And they get to work in June of 1866, right in the middle of summer, and they move about 1,500 bodies. Once they get to work, they start, their team starts writing down all the names that were previously identified and then where these guys are buried now in the new cemetery. And the reason that they're able to fit about 1,500 bodies in a 2-acre plot is essentially everything that was left was just bone. And so they're buried in about 2x2 wooden boxes. And at the original burial, there are some crude cedar head markers put there, and then later replaced with some limestone headstones and now marble today. During this time, there was what we called a cemetery book created, and it was made by Marcellus Cuppet, who was heading up the project here for the cemetery. And that's his ledger book to keep track of who's buried where. And after the cemetery is done, that book then passes on to John and Carrie. Now they become stewards of these boys' history, as well as the legacy here at the Battle of Franklin. That again passes on to their kids after that. One thing I do want to talk about, though, that I know everybody is always interested in as well, is the cemetery book and what it's recreated as. You can see right here how the cemetery is actually divided. This is the copy of the original cemetery book, and it was made, it was done by Hattie's husband later on in life, George Cowan, who was actually at the Battle of Franklin. He serves with the Confederate Army that day, and then later goes on to marry Hattie McGavock. Now, let's talk about some of the North Carolina soldiers that are buried at Carnton. There are 2 guys that are buried at Carnton. There were no North Carolina soldiers, I'll go ahead and tell you, that were at the Battle of Franklin that we can find. Now, these 2 soldiers from North Carolina, one we know was killed at the retreat from Nashville after Hood continues to pursue Nashville, and then eventually he has to retreat in late December of 1864. Private Robin L. Price is with the 39th North Carolina Infantry. He is an Ector's brigade, and he is killed during that retreat. He's buried somewhere in and around Franklin, and that's also why he ends up here at the McGavock's Confederate Cemetery. This cemetery is dedicated for Confederates. It's not just for the Battle of Franklin, so there are many other people that were buried in and around during this time around Franklin, and so it kind of just, they add them to this cemetery. So you see some people from Florida, you see some people, some smaller ones, as you can see from this book, a couple from Kentucky, couple from Louisiana, but you know that there's a lot of Louisianans in the Battle of Franklin. But there's also about 225 that are unknown. So those could have not just been Battle of Franklin, but those could have been also a couple of other ones. Now, the other guy that's buried there, his name is Hiram Fange. And originally when he's entered into the cemetery book, it's without either company nor regimental designation. So we don't know where he's from. He's also not matching under any Confederate units President Franklin. We've skimmed the list for his name, can't find him anywhere, but he at least does have a name, and we know that he was a Confederate during the Civil War. Now, these four people right here, like I mentioned, they are forever changed by what happens to them on November 30th, 1864. Winder inherits Carnton after his parents pass away. He lives there, he raises his family there, and he eventually will die there. Now, Hattie, she, like I mentioned, she marries a Confederate veteran who fought at Franklin. She lives just west of her brother at a place called Windermere, which she builds, that she can still see the cemetery every single day if she'd like. And 2 years before she passes away, like I mentioned, she remembers what happens that night. And 2 years before she passes away, she gives an interview and they ask her, "What do you remember?" She says, "The smell of smoke and the smell of blood." Those are the two biggest memories that she is always going to remember and that stay with her all throughout her life. You know, she remembers also all of their livestock that had gotten hit earlier on in the day. She can hear them moaning and groaning, and she can also hear the men. They just kind of drowned in together. But the sense of smell is the memory that stays with you until the day that you die. That never goes away. It's such a strong, strong memory. But the Battle of Franklin, this story, you know, the people here at Carnton, it extends just beyond that because it's a shared experience. And one woman's story I do want to talk about right now is Mariah McGavock Reddick. Now, Mariah, throughout the course of her entire lifetime, sees the entire scope of American citizenship change just before her eyes. Mariah is born in 1834 in Louisiana, and then she is gifted to Carrie as a wedding present in 1848 by Carrie's father. Mariah is 14 years old when she arrives at Carnton, and she becomes Carrie's personal slave. Throughout the course of her life, she has 11 children, 9 of them while she's enslaved. She only has 3 children after the war is over. Now, these are various pictures of Mariah all throughout her life. This is a younger one of her, and then this is also a post-war picture right here. This is also a post-war picture with her and her husband, Bolin Reddick. So during the war, like I mentioned earlier, in 1862, John sends all of his enslaved further south down to Alabama. And at this time, Mariah gets sent south, and she becomes a cook for a well-known household in Alabama of William and Margaret Howell. Now, the Howells have a daughter and an interesting connection. That daughter's named Varian, who in 1845 marries President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. The Howells and the Winders, Carrie's parents, were very good friends. And so that's one of their connections, which is why Mariah ends up down there. But after the war, she returns to Franklin. She lives in town. She gets married to Bolin. It's her first federal recognized wedding and marriage. And while she's living and working in town, she apprentices with a doctor and becomes a very skilled nurse and midwife. And all throughout this time, she becomes a very influential citizen within the town of Franklin. Now, this is also a great picture. These are descendants of Joe and Clara, who were also enslaved at Carnton, and then also Mariah. Mariah is right here in this picture, if I can get over to her. She is right here. She's roughly in her 80s by this point, and all the rest are some of her descendants and extended family. Now, this is 10 years before Mariah actually passes away. And throughout the course of her life, like I mentioned, she sees the entire scope of American citizenship change. If we think back to when she's born in 1834, meaning that she's born into chattel slavery. By 1863, she sees the Emancipation Proclamation. By 1865, she sees the end of the Civil War, the carrying out of the Emancipation, and then also the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed, which grant citizenship and then protect it. Now, by 1867, she witnesses something really big. In 1867, there are Franklin race riots that break out right outside her door. She becomes one of the witnesses in the court trials, and she also treats a lot of those men inside her home because she's a nurse and a very skilled midwife. She knows how to help people, and because it happens right there outside of her door, she's going to care for them as well. Now, she lives through Reconstruction. She lives through the first rise and fall of the KKK, which starts south of us in Pulaski, Tennessee, and makes its way into Franklin just shortly after that. Now, By the time she hits the turn of the 20th century, she'll live through the First World War, start to end, and then by 1920, she sees women vote for the first time. She sees the passage of the 19th Amendment. Throughout this time, like I mentioned, she becomes a very influential member within this community. All the people that surround her right here also become very influential members of the community. This lady right here, her name is Alice C. Odie. She is her granddaughter. She goes on to marry a man named Patton, and Patton actually will found one of the first Black-owned funeral homes here in and around Franklin. And they will actually go on to have a son named Thomas Gordon Patton. Now, he has an interesting connection too. So if we think about it, it's going to be Mariah's great-great-grandson or great-grandson. This is Thomas Gordon Patton. Now, the story extends to him because he's related to Mariah. And in World War II, he does something pretty amazing. Patton served during World War II, just like many others did, but he does something interesting. He joins the U.S. Air Corps alongside about 950 comrades to form the Tuskegee Airmen. And by the end of the war, men in the 332 fighter group established themselves as one of the most capable and successful squadrons in the Air Corps. Their military lineage can be traced back from the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, the Buffalo Soldiers in the Indian Wars, and then to the soldiers of the United States colored troops of the American Civil War. So if we trace back, their participation in the U.S. Army, it goes back all the way to the Civil War. And although there are no USCTs at Franklin, there are some at Nashville, which is why these are up. So at the heart of Franklin exists these two monuments right here. One is the Confederate Memorial Statue, and then the other one is the United States Colored Troops Monument. Everything is right down connected to the American Civil War on a daily basis. And it's also about how we remember the American Civil War for us and for everybody who visits our site. Part of that lies right here at the heart of Franklin, like I mentioned, with the Confederate Memorial Statue that was dedicated for all the men in the town of Franklin who had died during the war. Now, memorials just like this that you see on the left-hand side go up all across the United States. They're very, very common. They look nothing like, anybody specific or particular, but they're just to memorialize all of those who fought and served during the war. Now, this is a picture in 1900 of another one of those unveilings. And Hattie and her daughter, Leah, are actually in the picture as well. Later on, you can go back and hopefully see it. But they're just right here. As they're also still, again, connected to what's happening in Franklin during this time, and they see this go up. Now, that's been up in the middle of Franklin, right at 5 Points at our city center, since 1899, after it's unveiled. And just recently, there's been another addition to it as well, which is that USCT monument. In recent years, the Battle of Franklin Trust and community members have taken the initiative with the Fuller Story Project to continue to incorporate important facts and context of the Civil War that not only that have never been conveyed in this space before. And so now, after the 2021 unveiling of the United States Colored Troops Monument and many more markers on the square, these complex stories of the Civil War that have been intertwined since the beginning are now in the public's view every single day. And you can't see one without the other, which is how it should be. You have to see context with them together. And therefore, it's not only important for us to just talk about one day, one moment, one person in history. Instead, it's a collective and shared experience during the American Civil War, from Black, white, civilian, soldier, rich, poor, North and South. Carnton's significance is, yes, tied to a catastrophic catalyst that launched the United States into a new era of growth and change. And that's why this story is important. It's not just about the McGavocks, it's not just about Mariah, but it's about everybody who was impacted by the Civil War, and everybody who came before and after. It's a turning point. Thank you guys for your time. I hope I have not gone over time, but I'm going to turn this back over to Stacy.
You're right on time. This is perfect. Thank you so much, Bailey. we have a few questions. So the first one is from John, and they ask, where were the Union dead buried in and around Carnton? Do you know?
Great question. So a large majority of them are actually buried in a large mass burial at Carter House, out near Carter House. And so let me get to this. So Carter House is right here. It becomes a part of the U.S. front line that day. And so in a large mass grave, that's where they're buried. All of the Confederate dead are kind of in a 2-mile stretch from Winstead Hill to Carter Hill, and they just are kind of scattered all throughout, buried in large mass trench graves initially. And then eventually the U.S. soldiers, though, are moved to a place called Stones River in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. It's a national cemetery. They're moved there because they are U.S. soldiers. The Confederate soldiers that fought at Franklin aren't going to be moved there.
So obviously you've done so much work on the history of Carnton and the family. Was there anything that you were really surprised to learn about them or the property and all this research that you've done?
I mean, everything's surprising every single day. There's something new around every single corner. I mean, we have thousands and thousands of soldiers' files, and just the few that I read to you guys today. I mean, there's more and more that pop up all the time, and there are descendants who continue to give information back to us, letters back to us to kind of help us piece together what this looked like. There's never going to be a time and place where you're ever going to recreate something like this. And so to be able to read their words and to get right down into that firsthand account is just unreal. And because the family never really talks about it afterwards, Hattie's the only one that says she remembers, the smell of smoke and blood, but I mean, she's 9 years old versus, an adult seeing that and being able to relay that information.
All right. Well, Bailey, thank you so much. This was an incredible talk. Thank you everybody who joined us this evening. We hope to see you at our next adult program, History and Highballs, Missing History, Jewish Life in Western North Carolina. That's a virtual program taking place Thursday, May 18th at 7 p.m. We hope to see you then. In the meantime, thank you everybody. Have a lovely evening. Bye.